Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right, check-ins. I'm about 15% nervous. It dropped down to about 13% saying that. I'm a little just bodily just exhausted at the moment. And I feel sort of like a kinship with Michael right now because he seems exhausted as well. So there's a little gratitude going on there. So welcome to the Stoa. I am Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we're very lucky to have Michael Brooks from the Michael Brooks Show. I'm very excited for this one because I want to engage more in these sorts of talks, sort of a more political talks, because it's something I've been shying away from. And my friend Cooper, he's on my case on this all the time, not being sort of the neutral observer role. So I'm really excited for this, and how it's going to work. Raven's going to formally introduce Michael, and then tell us how the Q&A is going to work, and then we'll go from there. So I'll hand it over to Raven.
Great, thanks, Peter. So today we're going to do a little bit of a dialogue with Michael, and then after the 20-minute dialogue, we'll open up to Q&A from everybody in the session. So Michael is an independent content producer and has a couple different shows that he works with. He's working with Jacobin. He has writing and works on their show there. He's on the Majority Report and also has his show, the Michael Brooks Show, where he's had Slavoj Žižek on, Lulu da Silva, lots of interesting figures. So we're really excited to have him today. He recently just wrote a book called Against the Web, and I hope that we can get into the content for that one. So Michael, welcome to the Stoa. Unmute yourself, sir.
I didn't realize I was muted. Apologies. It's good to be here, guys. Thanks so much.
So initially, could you just give us some context for the work that you do and what you're doing here today?
Well, I guess I'm here to talk about my book and other things, and I'm interested in how my work can connect in ways that are productive with people that are interested, I guess, in consciousness, for lack of a better word. So I'm interested in building those bridges, and Brent is a great facilitator of that. So I want to give props to him, and also Jeremy Johnson, who's another person in this world that whose work I really appreciate. I am a talk show host, essentially, and I, my primary vehicle is the Michael Brooks Show. A lot of the focus of that show is on international relations, on trends in global politics. I definitely am coming from a sort of a Marxist left, looking at things, trying to look at things in a very material and historical way, and figure out a better way of going into the future by actually being much more grounded in the past. So I think a lot of the work that I try to do is very historically oriented, particularly the longer forms and more deep dives. And one of the ways it actually intersects with the books, with the book, is really in feeling like a lot of kind of pop intellectual culture right now doesn't have a historical ground. And if we can start to have a historical grounding in things, we can have a much more dynamic opportunities for building a better political culture. So so Michael Brooks Show is probably the primary, that's my show, that's my vehicle, so that's probably the best way to really track what I'm doing. But yeah, I also do the show with Anna for Jacobin, and you could see me in a bunch of other outlets and I think with what some people might think to be some kind of contradictory impulses, but that's the synthesis. Like, on one hand, really trying to make a show that is grounded in a certain type of realism and attempt to look at the world as sort of clearly and dispassionately as possible in some ways, taking power really seriously and how power works. And then also at the same time, thinking that we need to get that some of the kind of questions that come from, I guess, spiritual places are relevant as well. So sort of like yeah, I think what some person, my show was described one time as like was like unwoke Al Jazeera.
Yeah.
And or which is interesting because I don't know how woke Al Jazeera is. I love Al Jazeera, but they are run, owned by the Qatari monarchy. Or Marx and Machiavelli meets Howard Stern and mindfulness. So that's kind of a flavor. But yeah, I'm interested in these kind of conversations that I think could be productive bridge building.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, you just had Dr. Cornel West on, and he's a revolutionary Christian, and you had a wonderful conversation about the role of spirituality in politics and the fact that I think largely it's missing. And that's something that stood out to me that makes you kind of a unique figure on the left to be talking about the spiritual elements of politics. But before we get into that, I'd like you to describe the thesis of your book and kind of the framework of your criticism of the IDW.
So the book, and in some ways the book, I mean, please, you should definitely go buy the book. It's a very good book. But I'll do a confession that, anytime you write a book, and a privilege and frustration, it can go either way, of doing live content multiple times a week, is that on one hand, I mean, there's a lot of content out there and plenty of room to make mistakes and think you could do things better. But on the other hand, it allows you to evolve day to day, and so to me, I mean, this is a cast of characters that I guess I was a lot more interested in, frankly, when I started the book. These folks don't occupy much of my attention right now. But the primary thing that I was interested in, and when I got contracted to do the book, was one, that I felt that these guys definitely were selling an ahistorical worldview. And that's a very big theme for me. I think you cannot pray or hope or anything to understand big questions about the economy, about why things look the way they look today, without looking at things in a historical process. And the reason that I refer to all of these guys as being somewhere on the right, in my view, even though I get that some of them are Democrats or whatever, but in a broader sense of understanding politics, what is your kind of frame, for what is your starting point for understanding things? And I think broadly, a left project looks at the material and historical forces as to why we are where we're at and how those things are operating. And I think that various right-wing projects, and by the way, in my view, there's some projects that might appear superficially very woke and quote unquote progressive that actually are quite conservative, because what they're trying to do is either naturalize things as a scientific process or mythologize things. So, you look at a lot of these folks, and my first big kind of collision with these guys was Sam Harris's writing on Islam. And, I guess I had objections that people would kind of expect on some sort of liberal grounds, that I think he was, kind of definitely being an asshole about it. And that there was very troubling implications from a policy perspective, what he was writing and what he was writing and advocating. But even more broadly was just the way that somebody thought that they could take on such an incredibly complicated terrain. And I mean, like stuff that you could spend as a scholar 2 or 3 years trying to understand what happened in Afghanistan from like 86 to 93 as a launching point for maybe scratching the surface of understanding the rise of a group like ISIS. And really thinking that you could skip over so much just reality and history, and kind of substitute thought experiments and a few opinion polls and some quotes from some holy books. That just kind of offended me intellectually. And I felt that and then Jordan Peterson came along, and I think the thing that caught me with Peterson was that, and as you said, especially I guess for somebody on the left, I'm not allergic to the spiritual stuff or the interest in mythology, I thought his basic framework was kind of boring, and I didn't think it was particularly convincing. But I thought what was interesting about him, and this is what leads to the what made the book more exciting for me to write, was that he was speaking to so many serious and urgent needs. And I think he was, misdiagnosing them. Again, I didn't find his the name of the chapter on him in the book is "The Dragon Who Didn't Do His Homework." So that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of my sort of how impressed I am with his work. But he was talking about serious stuff. He was talking about alienation. He was talking about lack of meaning. He was talking about really, really urgent things. And the response from the sort of conventional liberal sort of media was just to kind of point out the ways in which he was wrong, empirically or historically, which, fair enough. He gets a lot wrong. There's no doubt about it. He confuses Marxism with postmodernism in a way that, like, honestly, like any intro to history of philosophy class would clear up for you. But that wasn't really the point. The point was the themes he was speaking to. And if we didn't have a way of addressing those needs, then, we would just be kind of, failed moralizers, which is oftentimes so much of what kind of liberal politics basically is. And so I got interested in the book in terms of, okay, how can I answer what I think the mistakes these guys are making in ways that are bigger than them? Because I think that the models that they're using, that even if they go away, which they kind of have, they're still going to be replicated in other ways. This kind of impulse to take big, complex problems and reduce them down to simple stories. Then I also was like, yeah, I mean, clearly I think part of the reason they have so much resonance is because people in the sort of pop intellectual culture who represent the quote unquote left don't have very compelling answers to some of these things. And they have their own sort of boring, repetitive, moralistic narratives. And so I kind of saw it as an opportunity to address them and then create what I think is a much more compelling and dynamic and appropriate for being in such a globalized time kind of vision of what the left could be. So that's what the book is trying to do.
Excellent. And so I think that
Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, I enjoyed it myself. And I found that, I think I agree with you in the sense that, when you get into a group of people, and especially in response to a historical event, which I think that the culture wars and what was happening on campuses generally was, like, there was people on the left who were involved in things, and then suddenly this activity started, and it started to kind of split, right? In leftist politics and in metamodernism. And in other groups of people in this world, and a lot of people went reactionary alongside the IDW. So one of the things that I'm curious about is, now that kind of hype, I think, has passed generally, and now we're being pressed upon with more existential threats. I mean, the feeling that politics is important is really coming to the fore, even for people who thought that maybe they could be apolitical during this time. What would you say to people who went reactionary during this phase, in order to bring them into what I think you call Finland station or cosmopolitan socialism, and maybe describe what those two things are as well?
Yeah, so basically what I used in the book is a framework. And again, and I think people probably in this conversation will be more comfortable. Sometimes I do interviews and I notice certain audiences are hyper literalistic, which is a problem definitely in the IDW scene, and also in a lot of, some of the left scene as well. But I don't mean these, and they weren't originally meant as, these are not precise scientific definitions, but they indicate different ways of being in the world and looking at politics. So Bhaskar Sunkara, who's a collaborator of mine, he founded Jacobin magazine, talked about Singapore station, Hungary station, and Finland station as three basically, three basic models of how to relate to politics. And Singapore is the world outpost of a certain type of neoliberal project. And if you look at anything from Fareed Zakaria to Davos to Thomas Friedman, again, it's not literally that people want to be Singapore, but what Singapore valorizes, what Singapore has succeeded in, and what Singapore also does not include, is really the kind of endpoint of a certain type of technocratic neoliberalism. There is some degree of tolerance and respect and openness. People are judged along really their performance and contribution to the market system. There's a real, I mean, it's no mistake that, you know, Singapore is the one that's testing the robotic dog from Boston Dynamics, you know, to friendly, you know, gently remind people at public parks to keep social distance. You see this in the mayorship of Bloomberg in New York. And it's, you know, people know their place and people fit in a technocracy, and there is some room to advance, you know, along a market hierarchy potentially. And again, whether or not we're talking about places that are formally kind of managed non-democracies, or even the way a lot of, you know, I mean, Thomas Friedman in the late 90s has a famous phrase called the golden straitjacket, where he says, look, you can have elections and we can, you know, have competitive marketplace of politics, but if you don't have core economic rules in place that situate you for globalization, you're out of the game. And that is a very, you know, that's a core kind of Singapore statement. Then Hungary's station represents this rise of these new kind of neo-authoritarian right-wing leaders that people talk about a lot. This, you know, Bolsonaro and Trump and Orban and so on. And, you know, there's, again, this is another thing, you can make distinctions between these different people and the different ways they're historically situated. But for purposes of this, they represent a kind of wanting to go back into the past, an imagined community of the past, a backlash in some ways against social liberalism, but really a strong defense of market and capitalist activity as well, but wanting to preserve basically various types of, you know, in the America's case, say, like a white identitarian politics along with that market formulation. And Finland's station represents, you know, Lenin on his way back before the Soviet Revolution. And again, this is not about getting into a big debate about the Soviet Union and what it was and all of this, but that revolutionary activity. And the proper reading of Marx is that it's a fulfillment of an expansion of democracy project. The idea was that just as the sort of divine right of kings was interrogated in the political realm, people need a great deal of more agency and power over their own economic lives. And you know, the events of 1917 are extraordinary. I mean, that level of public participation and energy for the idea that you're going to get rid of a feudal system and also get rid of kind of a discredited parliamentary, you know, not that you wouldn't still have a democracy, but that you would have a substantive democracy is dynamic and important. And so the argument of the book is really that the IDW and a lot of right-wing politics represents different, and a lot of our world politics today represents a conflict between Singapore and Hungary, and we need more Finland. And so I think to people who've been really caught in the IDW, I guess, and kind of reactionary politics, I guess I would say on one hand, that's maybe more inviting, is that you can tune into a much bigger world of politics today and find much more dynamic and compelling answers, and maybe some of the things that put you off to kind of pop liberal discourse, that these kind of two simplistic things are not the choice. It isn't, you know, you don't have to listen to IDW guys, you know, freaking out about trans people and endlessly whining about political correctness. And you don't need to, I don't know, go and read the top 10 reasons that Seinfeld is problematic or whatever the hell it is that was going on in you know, trash kind of pop woke culture. That there are people who are really doing work to try to understand why we are where we are today. And I think, you know, again, some of the manifestations of this are things like, you know, Bernie Sanders and so on, which particularly in the United States, having an agenda of basic universal decency that has never been achieved here is really significant. There's also people who are trying to understand, and the cosmopolitan component is, you know, these guys have this fixation on this mythological idea of the West. This is the last thing I'll say. I think they've, in various ways, particularly Peterson, I guess Ben Shapiro too, although I mean obviously I take him less seriously, but they have this very romantic and ahistorical idea of what the West is. Now the sort of shallow woke response to that is to say, well, no, like screw the West. The West has always been evil. The West has always been corrupt. My response and the response to the tradition I'm in, whether it's CLR James or Cornel West or Adolph Reed or Fatima Mernissi or people like this, is to say, well, first of all, the quote unquote West is literally an ahistorical concept. There is no unbroken chain from Greece to today. And even when we go back to Greece, we're already talking about a society that was Pan-Asian and African, had a variety of influences from its inception. And a great tradition that of course we should be reading along with everywhere else in the world. And the way this sort of links up, and the last example I'll give is in the 1990s, there was a really big debate on something called Asian values. And these were countries that actually are going to be, they're coming back into the discourse because Orban is he'll say specifically he's influenced by some of the conversations that we're having in Malaysia and Singapore in the 90s. And in this time of like big triumphalism in the post-Cold War world, there were these two positions. And one was that, you have to get on board with the Western model of democracy and quote unquote human rights. And these certain Asian leaders like Lee Kuan Yew would saying, no, that's ridiculous. We have our own conception of human rights. We have our own conception of how we do society, right? Because we come from a different value tradition. And very big influence on me, Amartya Sen, who's an Indian economist and philosopher. And he was at Oxford at the time. And he said, this is a ludicrous debate because the Western chauvinists are acting as if they have invented, and again, in this ahistorical flow, like from Socrates to Clinton, we came up with human rights, we came up with democracy, we nailed it, everybody should just copy us. And then these Asian values leaders are misreading their own traditions to justify their own autocratic practices. And actually what you can do is you can easily have a reading of Confucianism or Indian philosophy or African, that talk about transparency, that talk about open dialogue, that you can fit into a broader quest for quote unquote human rights. So the sort of answer was, there are universal aspirations, there are universal things joining people, but they don't come from one source. So in other words, and it's interesting because a lot of these arguments track today on both the left and the right? You'll see on the right, this kind of resurgence of Western chauvinism, which again is ahistorical, and particularly in 2020, it's showing, in the 1990s, it was triumphant. In 2020, it's very insecure because China's rising. And this just doesn't fit with the world as it works and looks today. But then on both the populist right and this neo-nationalism, where there's obsessions with the nation state, there's these fixation on the idea that there are distinct communities and they can't necessarily overlap in healthy, open democracies. And then even on parts of the left that push so far into identitarian politics that from like standpoint epistemology, it's like we can never overlap on anything because our experiences are too different. So all we have to do is sit on platform capitalist platforms of, from Silicon Valley and, berate each other or hear each other or recognize each other. We can never have a tangible common project. And so I thought Sen was so relevant, and I connected it with my own really strong orientation towards labor politics and the things that everybody needs, regardless of where they are: healthcare, housing, greater power over their economic lives. But that this Sen model was so relevant because people are rightfully wanting to have their own narratives about progress, democracy, and things like that, rooted in narratives that aren't just the usual Western ones. That's a correct impulse. And they want, and it's one that's showing up on both the left and right in very different ways. And you can't just dismiss that. But then on the other hand, we actually need to hold the idea that in fact there are universal commonalities, there are similarities, there are shared impulses, there are shared trajectories. And the best way to recognize that is by actually being truly global in that sense, so that you're in a process of addition, not subtraction.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to open up questions from the chat. So if you have any questions for Michael, go ahead and put them in there and I'll call on you and you can unmute your mic. But until somebody asks a question, I wanted to ask you, so we're talking about like this kind of universal value, which of course goes against the idea of postmodernism. So you can't really lump you into a postmodern perspective because we have this idea that, but also that there's this multipolarity, right? That this idea of human rights shows up in cultures in various places at various times in history. Is there some connection to spirituality here? Do you think that there's a relationship between kind of fighting for this higher element of human freedom and also spiritual practice?
It certainly is in some places. I mean, one of the kind of funny positions that I'm in is that some of my critique of standard issue Western liberalism comes because I am, very interested in and trying as best as possible to be engaged with other places. So, Brazil is a place that's very important to me. President Lula was the world's most important political prisoner. I had the, great honor of going to Sao Paulo and interviewing him. And, you can't understand. I mean, you can't understand the Workers' Party certainly without understanding trade unionism and socialism. And you also can't understand it without understanding liberation theology. So I don't, so to me, regardless of whether or not you're personally engaged that way, there just needs to be a much more mature and cosmopolitan conversation about religion and spirituality and the different ways it manifests. I think what this book potentially could point to, I don't go into it, but I think that a corollary with understanding that intellectual and political movements are in relationship. Like I just was watching a great interview with the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, who was talking about that when he was organizing in Europe as the information minister for the African National Congress against apartheid, how it was really striking being in Ireland, because he would see, he was like, yeah, we needed everybody's, help, and it was great. But the conversation in London was different. In Dublin, they had books for me to read that were relevant for how we were building our own strategies. And that to me is incredibly inspiring. But even beyond that, I think that it could point to, if we're in a process of an addition, not subtraction, I think people's ways of relating and being in the world existentially and in terms of individual and community could be relevant. So that to me does point to the validity of being open to spiritual experiences and how they interact with people's approach to politics and those quests that we were talking about. So I think it's possible. I mean, I also will say, like, I think postmodernism has become kind of a stand-in for, the work of questioning power narratives and how things get naturalized. That isn't the primary home of my politics, but I could tell you that, if you had to read Foucault, love him or hate him, or Derrida or whatever in college, you pretty quickly got that this wasn't the same as somebody going, that's just like your opinion, man. Like, it's very demanding stuff. So I do want to note that too. And I actually think another thing that is being reacted to that I guess in this bunch, like Harris really exemplifies, even though he has this kind of funny, he's a promoter of meditation, but I think a very flatland approach to reality that has no distinction making when it comes to certainly spirituality and religion, right? That it's all just quote unquote untrue. And that's all you need to know. And that to me, again, just even sort of anthropologically, I don't know what does the truth claims of the Bible have to do with liberation theology in the Union Building on San Bernardino. Like it's totally irrelevant, and it shrinks your worldview in really disastrous ways for, you know, understanding how things work.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah. So let me see how I'm going to formulate this. Questions around sort of like strategy, outreach for political ideas. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Brent's always on my case. Like, Peter, you got to be more political. You got to be more political. I'm like, okay, not yet, not yet.
He's right.
And just thinking into it, just listening to you speak, it's like a lot of this feels above my pay grade, right? And I know if I did my homework, if I just sat down and just like read it, I'm like, yeah, I could grok it. And just thinking about that resistance I have to even want to engage in politics, it's like what you said. It's like there's like it's like they're trying to manipulate my emotions all the time. It's like this scintillating, like on the social justice warriors shaming you for being a white male, then the intellectual dork web attacking you for this or that, for not being based enough. And I'm just like, okay, fuck off. You know, I just go away. Like, and my stoicism kicks in and my reps there, and I just want to create some distance. And I think in that act, it's like almost the whole category of politics I push away, and I don't want to engage in it. So I guess to tease out a question there is how to ethically go about talking about these very important issues that you're talking about in such a way that's attractive to people like me. And I imagine someone who's have a meta awareness of this, a lot of people don't. So I guess what is your current strategy, or what is a good strategy to go about that?
Well, I mean, you know, that's ever evolving, right? And also you don't know. I mean, one of the things that's funny to me about this whole terrain is, like, you know, again, I mean, you see this with, I guess, you know, some of these IDW characters, you know, all day, like, oh, like, don't be a snowflake. And meanwhile, you know, oh my God, you criticized the guy that I like his books, and I'm going to have like a 3 weeks mental breakdown and, you know, harass you on Twitter. So I think I think you actually have to distinguish between form and substance, right? So, you know, and again, I don't really, I find that sort of like very basic pop cultural politics debate to be incredibly boring. And there are moments where it's like, you know, I don't know what to say, like arguing about nonsense. And the things that are going to actually drive and are driving our world today, whether we're talking about pandemics or 5G or arms control or you having healthcare, like, you know, there is that phrase of like, politics is interested in you regardless of whether you're interested in it. So I think you have to make a really big distinction there. Then I think, you know, I would make a distinction between, you know, a mediocre representation of ideas that might have some validity and some relevance versus something that is just sort of, you know, hacky and redundant. But, you know, I don't know, as far as communicating these ideas, it's very difficult because I've as an example, I've had feedback from some people that say like, oh, you got me much more engaged in politics. In fact, you changed my politics because the show is intellectually open and whatever, but it's also funny. It also has a certain attitude to it. It's also entertaining. I see other people who, you know, I don't know, I did some impression of Jordan Peterson like 18 months ago, and they are unable to watch an interview with Cornel West. They're so emotionally distraught by that. And so, you know, in my own process, it's a dialectic. You know, sometimes I get the feedback around, you know, sort of what you're saying, and my response is like, ironically, it's kind of just like, Jesus, dude, I don't know what to say. Man up, like, read a fucking book. Like, this should not be so like heavy. It shouldn't be so like emotionally dramatic. Like, take some of that stoicism and ride out a few uncomfortable conversations and get engaged in this stuff. Like, read the Financial Times. This is real, and you know, extremely real. And then, you know, on the other hand, I'm very cognizant and very aware that so much communication from both honestly, politics that are just not my politics, but I recognize will get put in the sort of same basket, but they're not my politics. And even people with, with my politics, there's folks that are absolutely brilliant and incredible, but, it's either it requires like a serious theoretical background to engage with, or it's just kind of, it just isn't immediately accessible. And so I think those are really valid concerns, and I'm not always sure how to address them. I mean, I've tried to think of one aspect is, can the stuff be fun and entertaining? The other aspect is, what can I learn from somebody like Cornel West in terms of just like the energy of the presentation? He's like a really big hero of mine. Yeah. Though also I do think with some of these people, whether we're talking about Cornel West or Lula or whatever, I mean, we can apprentice these people, but that's going to come with age, you're never going to be able to project that kind of, like, I don't know, there's so much work that needs to be done internally and externally, but you can model the best. And then that third, that I think bringing people in through, again, I'll mention Lula, I think people have gotten a pretty good understanding of some things that were happening in Brazil through this heroic story. And, it's a story of a person that opens up a big thematic range. And, the last thing I'll say is I definitely on my show, and definitely what I'm trying to push people towards are, people like Adolph Reed, who's a huge influence on me, who I have massive respect for. And his writing on essentialism and economics and identitarian politics, it's like, it isn't even just that it is neither the SJW stuff that you're responding to or this kind of embarrassing IDW stuff. It's like actual politics. It's like, it's not only is it transcending that debate, that's like a couple of sophomores in high school throwing food at each other. And I'm recommending that you read like a seasoned labor organizer and Penn professor who has developed a model since like the 60s that really makes a lot of sense and is very historically grounded. So I think some of it is just, and maybe that takes some patience, because some of that stuff is, that stuff is demanding. It isn't just like a Twitter argument.
Right.
It does require to read things, but it's a lot more rewarding.
Yeah. And so like, here's my assessment. Let me know if you think I got it correct.
Sure.
And I see two, like Michael Brooks, and I want to loop in our kind of mutual hero, Colonel West, in a moment. But there's one that, like, right now, there's like, your arguments are incredibly cogent, you're coherent, like it's fucking tight, and you don't want to fuck with you in a debate, right? So that's like what we saw with Sargon. And then there's
that was another world then. Jesus Christ.
And then there's that kind of like that devilish Michael Brooks come up when like Sam Harris's name comes up, you just fucking like go off the rail on him. And I kind of like it too, because he kind of annoys me a little bit. But like you said, there's like a bifurcation, because there's people who like Sam Harris. There's like a parasocial relationship that they have with him, and they could get triggered in the wrong way, or they might get seduced the right way. And I see you just being authentic. I just see you being you, and then you have these two personalities. But like you said, our mutual hero West, like Trump, his ideological component, brother Trump, right? The guy is like, just, you feel his ideas are coming from a place of love. And so I don't know if there's a question here, but like, I guess, how do we be more like West, or how do we get guys like West to be more influential?
Well, West is pretty influential, but I mean, I think that the trick in what you're saying, though, and again, this is a funny thing, because I see this both certainly in a lot of places on the left, like, oh, why can't you be nice, or whatever. And I see this in a lot of places on the right, frankly. I mean, Cornel West, it isn't just that Donald Trump is his ideological opponent. He says he's a fascist and a gangster and an existential threat to humanity. I mean, this guy is so clear. And he's got his spiritual practice of deeply recognizing a shared humanity with even the worst of us. So I actually think that what Cornel West is doing, and what I will aspire to do and fall short on constantly definitionally, is a space that is completely missing from these conversations, and we need to figure out a way to build, which is, on one hand, there is a soft, indulgent culture that is not at all exclusive to the left. I see it in every space where people cannot deal with criticism, they can't deal with rigor, they can't deal with having their ideas interrogated. And then conversely, people completely dehumanize each other,
Right.
to the point where I actually start to see why the stakes feel so intense. Because if we actually had a culture where we recognize that we're all human beings who have made mistakes, will make mistakes, maybe sometimes even serious mistakes, get things wrong, and that there was a process around evolution and rebuilding instead of tearing down and destruction, I think people's anxiety levels would go down a lot more.
Right.
So I think that it's a really hard process. And this is something that I'm thinking of a lot more recently. I don't exactly know how to engage with it, but I will say, I notice people skip the sides of the equation. Like, some people say, like, oh, Cornel West kills them with kindness, and it's so great the way he calls somebody a brother before he like rips them and and beats the shit out of them. And then spiritual people are like, oh man, it's so great the way he does that. And it's like, he's doing both.
Yeah, I agree.
And he's really doing both. And so I think the question is how do we cultivate a culture that allows for both? And maybe, honestly, I do think some of these social media platforms, not necessarily, I think obviously being able to do a show in these new podcasts and YouTube vehicles or whatever is incredibly lucky and interesting. It has its own problems. But I do think I just don't ever think there's any way of generating a healthy Twitter discourse, as an example.
Yeah.
I think it really does lend itself to exactly the wrong kind of incentive structure. So yeah, I think, and look, and I can totally say with regards to Sam Harris, like and again, I find this to be another interesting tension. I don't like him. I find the worldview, the presentation, I think it's actually incredibly mediocre, and I think it's attached to like an extraordinary kind of arrogance, and I don't like it. But I also, of course, I've definitely had to ask myself, I don't know what the answers are. I don't know why that pisses me off so much at times. Although, again, already, I'm sure the way I talk about these guys today is different than I talked about them 2 years ago, maybe even a year ago, because I'm in my own process. So I think that if you want that Cornel West space, it's going to embrace a really interesting contradiction, because it's going to involve so much more actual tolerance and so much more actual ability, but then, and forgiveness and openness, but it's also going to be a lot more rigorous. I mean, one of the things in that interview that was so fun that he did was, he was praising my book, which was blowing my mind. And he had this great line, which I don't know how many people caught, but it was like this beautiful slight dig at the people I'm writing about and at me, where he's like, it's a great book. He goes, these aren't the most profound brothers that you took on. Beautiful. It's like a little bit like, yeah, great. You ran circles around these guys. Like,
be humble.
And he even did a thing. He goes, you didn't take on like Plato and Edmund Burke. I was like, that's true. That's a very good point. And then but then also, what a great shade on them.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's, again, I think sometimes we just gotta, we talked about the Jordan documentary earlier. I mean, so we just got to watch and prototype the best people to some extent.
Yeah, I'll hand it back to Raven, but what just come to mind is, Brent, the whole metamodern movement, they call it philosophical allergies. And like just certain, like people and ideology just trigger you. You don't know why. Like Sam Harris, like my read on that, there's like this is a concealed arrogance, just the performance there. And it just annoys me.
Right.
I feel like annoyance in my body when I hear him talk, even though I can like be stoic enough to separate and to see his good ideas for what they are, like the meditation stuff and whatnot. And what we're doing here at the Stoa is sort of developing like what John Vervaeke, ecology of practices, like a wisdom gym. That's the cute word we're running with. but where you can kind of like develop these cogent, coherent arguments, not compromise them, but still like sink into the felt sense level and become embodied and come from a place of love. And there's like not an answer for that, like how to do that successfully, but I really appreciate your being, at the edge here with that, with us.
Great. Brent, please share your long question.
Thank you. Actually, you guys covered you anticipated and said a lot, so I can kind of abridge my question. But if I may, to address Peter's question about politics, I just wanted to say, like in my view, it's not about knowing which horse to back, because that's complicated. It's about knowing what correct policies to advocate for first, and then knowing which horse to back to deliver them, right? So in that context, like, it should be clear, like Medicare for all is not debatable, right? Because healthcare is a human right. So my question was along the lines of, how we can do better. And this session is a huge step in that direction. And I wanted to say quickly, like, I love the comedy stuff too, but that's not for everybody, right? The dunking has its limits. And so, sort of by way of analogy, Carlos Maza was on the Surfs, and I asked what he thought of the Ezra Klein Ben Shapiro interview, and he said he hadn't seen it, but he gave a great answer, which was, Ben Shapiro is a bad actor, and basically Ezra Klein is a naive actor. So of course it's going to fail on those grounds to have any traction or to change anybody's minds. And likewise, behind the scenes with the IDW, there's lots of connections between people, and we could actually break this down a lot quicker if we tried to. So my question was, along those lines, like, what can we do to accelerate the process? Because we're sort of running out of time with climate change, with the political crisis, and the whole IDW thing. I say all the time, like, look, on one hand, maybe it had to happen, but it just felt like a huge waste of time and a huge distraction. and however much ostensibly liberal they might identify, right, their kind of pseudo-intellectual discourse helps facilitate more Trumpism, right? Even if Ben Shapiro is anti-Trump, it facilitates more Trumpism. So, the task is for people to dramatically change their minds in terms of metanoia. And, there's people like Peter Dow, who's a great example of that. He's very self-conscious about his transformation from a Hillary Clinton advocate to a big Bernie surrogate. And there's a few other people, but it's rare, and just to give another little anecdote about bad actors.
Brent, I'm just going to jump in. There's other people that have questions, so maybe you can tease out a question here.
Yeah, I'm wrapping it up. Sam Harris is a bad actor. If there's any salience to this concept of metamodernism, I emailed Sam Harris in 2016 from a supportive stance to say, hey, would this interest you? And he never got back to me. Noam Chomsky got back to me within an hour, right? So it's, and there are two people who have clashed. So my question just is, what can we do better to Michael and to all of us, to Peter? How can we accelerate this process?
I think that the one thing that I would just move off of briefly from that is, I read a lot of Ken Wilber when I was younger. I was a big Ken Wilber guy. And he was helpful for practice ideas. And, I was doing my meditate and take a run, do yoga, because I was a Ken Wilber guy. But, I was studying international relations. And again, it wasn't that his writing on politics I certainly disagreed with, but it was also just like, it wasn't credible. Like, I'm just trying to think of an analogous field. It was just like, okay, like, I know enough that this guy is not reading the people in the literature. He's not reading. So I think one thing with something like metamodernism, it's very helpful to really start. Now, look, obviously I have my politics, so I know who I think the best people are, but along with Dr. West's joke, it's like, if you want to build a meta-modern framework, you have to make sure that the people that you're plugging into it are actually really good at what they're doing. So I think that if you're saying like, okay, we're going to try to synthesize, East and West, left and right, and then your examples are like, oh, I'm picking some like random cult leader from India and some like liberal columnist for the New York Times and some like, new atheist guru, you're missing people that might represent things from analogous perspectives in all of those spaces that are a lot more demanding and a lot more sophisticated. And again, because like I keep thinking of this Adolf Reed example, because there's so many arguments that I see that take place in this kind of cultural terrain that I know that it's like he just covers them better. And it's not even a question of like, yeah, of course, I'm sure he would come down on one side or another of things, but he genuinely transcends this debate. And if you want to take that on, then you got to read stuff that is analogous level to him to take on. So I think part of accelerating the process is making sure that the sources we have are good. And that's one of the things that I did that I liked about doing this book too, is just honestly alternative, like these are more interesting people to read. It's more interesting to read Cabral. It's more interesting to read Adolf Reed. And it's more interesting to read, people that are really engaged in this stuff. So yeah, that's where I would start, but I'll wrap it up so we can get a few more in.
Great. Looks like maybe we could get in one more question
We
before you
can
have
do,
to.
guys, I can go like another 10 or 15. I have another thing, but it's less tight than I thought it was. So we can go a touch longer.
Okay, that's excellent. So yeah, we'll cover one final question and we'll let you answer it to your leisure. Let's see here. So Ron, we are getting to your question. Would you like to ask
thank
it?
you. And you may have touched on this already, Michael, but and pardon if there's a little rambling. Coming in, I definitely had resistance to the idea that Harris and Peterson particularly are on the right, so to speak. I know how they look that way under maybe our current political categories and lenses and whatnot. And I'm very into the meta-modern stuff, I would say, just so my perspective. And we had a thing on that just a couple hours ago. And I look at someone like Peterson, I can't say about Harris, as a meta-modern phenomena in many ways. And interestingly, as I'm listening to you today, and I find I'm having way less resistance to your talk than I thought I might have had coming in. So that's always a pleasant surprise. And usually people who identify as being in the left, I sometimes will find I have a resistance. But I'm finding your overall approach and vibe, whether you think this way, is meta-modern to me. So I wonder, so from my strange political lens, admittedly, I almost look at someone like Peterson and yourself as both meta-modern in many ways and different threads of that widely, viewed, and that maybe need to come together and clash and tweak and work out stuff. So does that click with you at all, that maybe in some way, some of these guys that you have the differences with, you're all part of something meta-modernish alike that's emerging and just needs to be worked out? A lot of stuff needs to be worked out.
I mean, I guess I look, because I don't know if, I think where Jordan Peterson is in a lot of the terrain that I talk about politically, he is objectively on the right. And that's not like a problem per se. I frankly I'm not into the not saying where you are part. So if you go to meet with Orban, and this is a guy, to be clear, there's a lot of melodrama in conversations. Viktor Orban a couple of weeks ago, like formally, temporarily, has suspended democracy in Hungary. And he's gone further than, and there's a lot of tendencies this way, certainly with Bolsonaro and definitely in some key ways with Trump. When Jordan Peterson flies there and hangs out with him, and they kind of have a complain about liberal college professors fest, the most generous thing I could do is that he is not in the world and does not understand the dynamics he's playing with. And I think that that is a really big problem. So again, part of what I would go to is I think if we started from a very different baseline and we recognize, because it's certainly like my perspective is with Brent, like if we're talking about the United States, I guess the policies and agenda that would be identified as like the quote unquote left to achieve those things, like completing the New Deal, getting everybody healthcare. I mean, these things aren't, in any kind of global sense, would be centrist, and they are morally obvious. And I think confusing them is really problematic. I think that there are people that interest me more, frankly, than Peterson, but who do speak in similar terrain. I mean, he's passed. If James Hillman was still around, I would be really excited to interview him. I think his work on archetypal psychology was fascinating. And it actually it integrated with a very interesting critique of psychotherapy, sort of the opposite of Peterson's, which is that psychotherapists are getting tasked with solving problems that are socially generated. They mean this in a very broad sense. You know, he had a lot of really good, like, yeah, of course there's depression and anxiety in the culture we're living in. You know, there's a lot to be sort of upset about. And he managed that with also a very clear discourse on, I guess, what would be called personal responsibility. Scott Atran is an ethnographer who has actually studied and worked with the United Nations and various other agencies, terrorism, like in a real way, and has talked from an anthropological perspective about the loss of meaning and sacred value drives and how they relate to why people join groups like this. So Peterson, not so much. And maybe I think meta-modern is important, but I also looked at things kind of dialectically. So I think that there was this vacuum in the culture that he came in and filled, and necessarily someone had to fill that. I wish it was filled better, right? But I think that maybe the vibe you're getting from me, and where I'm much more receptive, and I hope it comes across, is that the terrain he is on in some key areas is a totally valid terrain, even as I would have, you know, a pretty tough critique of him. But I think that if you're interested in meaning, purpose, these types of things, of course, we all should be interested in these types of things. I hope that answers your question somewhat. Yeah. And I totally think that it goes back to what I was saying to Brent too. Of course, there can be really big, I don't think it's that everybody has the same perspective or the same politics, but I think there's baselines of sophistication that you have to clear first. Just as, like, conversely, I didn't write a chapter saying that Jordan Peterson doesn't know anything about Jung. You know, I'll cede that to him, but he should cede politics to me.
Excellent. And with that, are there any final statements you'd like to say, Michael, before we close up the session?
It's just an honor. It's a real pleasure, and I look forward to more. If you guys want to collaborate more, and Raven, thank you, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, Brent, for pushing this along, and thanks to everybody who participated. And I hope everybody stays safe and stays strong out there.
Yeah, definitely. I hope that we can continue to have these conversations. I think the integration here is really important, and it's very timely. So I really appreciate you coming and kind of provoking us to think about these issues, and of course for writing your book. And I wanted to end just with a quote from Cornel West that I just loved from your interview with him, which is, "To be a blues man in the life of the mind." Just love that. So
amen.
Yes, amen to that. So Peter, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, so I'll make some announcements for next events. But first, brother Michael, thanks so much for coming on. Greatly appreciated. Brent, thanks so much for being annoying in the wise way, and everyone for the questions today, and of course Raven for excellent emceeing today's event. So tomorrow we have unasked questions with Nora Bateson. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern time. We have relational exegesis, the group papers with Freyja. I'm pronouncing her name. That's at 4 p.m. And then Radical Honesty During a Pandemic with the self-help author Brad Blanton. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can RSVP on the website. And if you're inspired to provide a gift, you can just go on the website, and then there's check out the gift economy there. All right, everyone. Thanks so much.